In the previous recording, we looked at the introduction to a number of the key characters in the text. In this recording, we will look at Uncle Frank in greater detail, and we'll also look at the moment I think that shapes the text, that sets the tone for what is to come, and is really it really ramps up the tension and the level of intensity of the text. So it all comes to a head when Marie begins to get sick. So we learnt in the last recording about Marie, who she was, and her role in the family. And after learning this, David's mother returns home, and David, having listened to Marie cough for most of the day, says to his mother that he thinks Marie is sick. His mother is instantly alarmed because she hates sickness. David describes her as a foe of sickness. You know, she's very careful to keep her family healthy, and she straight away goes in to see Marie to see what the difficulty is. We learn later that Marie has pneumonia, an infection of the lungs. His mother mentions to Marie that she's going to bring in Frank to look at Marie, and Marie reacts really strongly against that. She says, "No, I don't need no doctor." The mention of Frank clearly upsets Marie, clearly, clearly upsets her and clearly makes her nervous about what is to come. And she's really, really clear that she doesn't want to see a doctor, and that particularly she doesn't want to see Frank. Um, you know, she's David's mother believes at that time that her determination not to see the doctor is due to her frugalness. Marie is famous for saving money and items, and Marie is sort of misinterpreted by David's mother here. And David's mother believes that it's simply because Marie wants to save money, and she tells Marie that it will be free. Marie is clearly very sick. She needs to see a doctor. David walks past her room that afternoon, and he hears her hallucinating and talking due to her fever. She's very scared of seeing Frank. She calls David into her room and tells David, "I don't need no doctor, Davy. Tell them." In the next scene, we see the first suggestions of one of the key themes of this novel, which is the transformation of David from a child to a young adult. It's one of the key themes in this text, and we'll talk later about it more specifically in later recordings. But this is a very important moment, and it's something that it's important that you take note of. David's father tells him that, "I hear you've been babysitting the babysitter," and David realizes how naive he has been. He realizes for the first time that one of Marie's duties is to look after him, and it's one of those key moments where you transfer from child to adult when you realize that things that weren't necessarily clear to you before. David tells his parents that Marie has made it very clear that she does not want to see a doctor, but his father responds that that's just superstition, David, Indian superstition. David then goes on to explain his father's racist view of Indians. He says that my father did not like Indians, and he sort of clarifies this. He says that that's not that he disliked them personally. He could be generous and kind to them, but he simply held them in low regard. David says he was not a hate-filled bigot, and he could treat Indians with generosity, kindness, and respect. Nevertheless, he believed that Indians, with only a few exceptions, were ignorant, lazy, superstitious, and irresponsible. So his father clearly has a negative view of Indians, and it's a racist view. David says to his father, she said she doesn't need one in regards to a doctor, and his father replies sarcastically, "What does she need, David? A medicine man." We're just going to talk briefly here about racism towards Indians up to this stage in the text, and sort of overall as well as a theme. We learned earlier that Ronnie, Marie's boyfriend, didn't go to college despite being one of the best athletes in the town. David says that he sort of just understood at that time that the Indians were not for college. His father, when he's talking about Marie, says that my guess is that she's never been to anyone but the tribal medicine man. If Frank says that if it doesn't work, his medicine doesn't work, he'll try betting some drums or do a dance around the bed. So we see that people are really condescending towards Indians, American Indians, that it's clearly racist and it's clearly a patronising view of them. And the effect of this racism is important. That's what's really important here. This racism allows Frank to get away with what he does for so long. There are people in the town who know when David's mother talks to Daisy, Len's wife. She whispers, the rumor is he doesn't do everything on the up and up, but it's just the squaws, which is a derogatory term for Indian women. And it's this sort of sense that, it's okay because it's their Indian women. this sense that because they're Indians, it doesn't matter as much. Um, and the further effect of this racism is that the Indians are powerless in the town. That if this was happening to someone else, to a white child, then something would have been done immediately. But because they're Indians, they're powerless. Look at the way in which David's grandfather refers to Frank's activities. It's sort of this dirty joke, the way he goes about talking about it. It's really quite offensive. Um, and just the whole attitude towards Indians is incredibly patronising. But the key effect of this racism is that it allows Frank to get away with what he's done with for so long, and it also makes what David's father does even more important, even braver, even more significant, because he's standing up not only against his family, but against racism as well. He makes a stand that no matter who it is, um, the law applies in all cases, and that Frank needs to be prosecuted. So Uncle Frank, let's talk a little bit briefly about Uncle Frank before we talk about what occurs in the household that evening. So David describes Frank as more charismatic than his father Wes. David says that he feels sorry for his father when his father and Uncle Frank stand next to each other because Frank is so impressive. He says even though David's father Wesley is an impressive man, he was tall, broad-shouldered, and pleasant-looking, Frank was all of this and more. He was handsome, dark, wavy hair, a jaw chiseled on such precise angles it seemed to conform to some geometric law, and he was as tall and well built as my father, but with an athletic grace that my father lacked. Remembering, of course, that David's father has a very badly injured leg. Frank was a genuine war hero. He left his medical posting during a battle to go and carry someone to safety, and he's decorated for this. He's witty and charming, and when compared to Frank, David felt his father was dull, steady, and predictable, but nothing glittered in my father's wake the way it did in Uncle Frank's. We also get a sense that Frank is very much the favoured child out of the two. When Frank returns, when there's a celebration for the veterans who have returned in the town, grandfather Hayden, says, I call on my son to come and speak. And it's very clear that Frank is the fathered son. Again, this makes what Wes does even more impressive. He stands up and does his duty in a really difficult situation there. So Frank arrives and he sees Marie, and Marie is sort of shouts out, "No, no!" She's determined that David's mother will stay in the room while the examination occurs. And sort of afterwards, Frank comes out, and the audacity and arrogance of what he says is really confronting, and really is a really quite horrible character. He says to David's father that Indians are used to being treated by the medicine man or some old squaw, but a doctor comes around and they think he's the evil spirit or something. And this is not the case. Maria's upset because this man is an evil man. But he sort of has the audacity to say, it's because they're backward and because they're ignorant and because they don't understand what's good for them. Again, that very patronising, very racist position. Then comes the moment of impact. This is one of the key moments in the entire text. It changes the entire tone of the story. It's like the story is smashed into. I think of it as being smashed into by a train, and nothing will ever be the same again. I'll now read the entire quote. This is David speaking. From where I stood on the porch, I could see into the living room, where my mother stood. She was staring towards the porch and standing absolutely still. Her hands were pressed together as they would be in prayer, but she held her hands to her mouth. I looked quickly behind me, since her attitude was exactly like someone who has seen something frightening. Nothing was there but my father and my uncle. And of course we understand later that the reason that she's standing there and looking like that is Marie has just told her everything that Frank has been doing. And Marie has been molested by Frank, and she knows other people who have been molested by Frank. His mother comes outside and she's very angry. Frank seems to sort of sense this and he beats a hasty retreat. And David says, I couldn't figure out why my mother seemed so angry. I'd always felt that she didn't particularly care for Frank. So Frank examines Marie. When he leaves, Marie talks to his mother. His mother comes outside very angry. Frank sort of senses the animosity and leaves. And then becomes another crucial moment. And this is another crucial moment in the transition from childhood to adulthood for David. His mother asks to speak to his father in private, and he stays to eavesdrop. He says about this choice, I would have lived my life with an illusion about my family and perhaps the human community if he had not stayed and listened. So what he hears sort of shatters his understanding of his family and sort of his understanding of human decency as well. Then comes one of the key exchanges in the text. So his mother says to his father, "Wesley, your brother has molested Indian girls. He's been doing it for years, Wes. He takes liberties, indecent liberties." Um, David's father then tries to justify what he's just heard. He doesn't come out right and attack Marie, but he sort of, again with this sort of sense that Indians are ignorant and backwards, he says, "I didn't say she was lying. Maybe she simply got it wrong." Saying that if you don't understand what a doctor does, then an examination could feel like it was something wrong. Um, he looks for ways to justify what he's heard. He doesn't want to believe what he's just heard. But David's mother does not let him. David knows that this is a defining moment in his life. "I flinched and a part of me said, 'Leave, get away, run, now before it's too late, before you hear something you can't unhear.'" This is from the top of page 47. "But everything changes. Before everything changes. But I pressed myself closer to the house and hung on." So this is him eavesdropping. He makes a conscious decision to stay and listen, and it changes his life. Again, so I think it's really important that you go through, read page 46, 47, 48. Of course, you're going to read the whole text, but go and reread these pages again because they're very, very important. And his mother outlines the accusations that Marie has made against Frank and what he's been up to. David then waits for his father to explode. And then he says this: "I waited for my father to explode, to shout a defense of his brother, to scream a condemnation of Marie and her lies. Instead, he said as quietly as before, 'Why are you telling me this?'" He's very upset. He's shattered, and straight away you can tell that he believes what he's heard. David waits for the defense, for the shouting, but it doesn't occur. Wesley accepts the accusations and now says, "Why are you telling me this?" And this is really important. He says, "Why? Why are you telling me this? Are you telling me because I'm Frank's brother? Perhaps because I'm your husband? Because I'm Marie's employer?" He paused. "Or because I'm the sheriff?" So he's got all these different roles here, David's father. He's got all these different roles, and he's like, "Well, which one of me are you telling? Are you telling the sheriff? Are you telling your husband? Who are you telling?" And she says, "I'm just telling you, Wes. I'm just telling you." And he says, "Well, I wish you hadn't told the sheriff part of me." Because once that sheriff part of him hears what's happened, he has to, because of the kind of man that he is, because of the way in which he upholds the law, because of the way he's moral, because of the way he does his job as the sheriff, he cannot turn a blind eye, and he, once hearing this, knows that he will pursue these allegations and he will get to the bottom of it. Okay, so he then basically begins to investigate like a sheriff, like a detective, and he claps his hands, which, as David says, is his usual prelude to action. And he's getting on a roll here now. He's made a decision. He's going to investigate, and he's going to find out and probably prosecute his brother. And he makes that momentous decision very quickly. And this is a clear sign again of his morality, of his courage, of his integrity. He's a man of integrity, Wesley. They go into Marie's room and he questions her, and hears, because he has to hear what she's told his wife so that he can begin his investigations. And David says at the bottom of page 49, "I was beginning already to think of Uncle Frank as a criminal. I may not have been entirely convinced of his guilt, but the story my mother told was too lurid, too frightening for me to continue thinking of my uncle in the way I always had. Charming, affable Uncle Frank was gone for good." So there's a big change here. David continues to play the sort of the innocent to his parents. He's like, "Oh, how is Marie?" Sort of pretending that he doesn't know what's going on, but he's overheard, he's listened, and he's understood. So in his own mind, he is maturing, but to his parents, he sort of plays dumb, that he doesn't know what's happening. He does this for a couple of reasons, I think. I think he's still a little bit upset and unsure about the whole scenario. He's not sure what he's going to do. And secondly, he does it so that he can continue to eavesdrop and to listen. He doesn't want his parents to know that he's been listening into their conversations and that he understands, because if he understands, they're going to take greater measures to prevent him from listening. So if he sort of comes across as naive and not understanding what's happening, he knows that he'll be better able to eavesdrop and follow the situation in that way. Wes goes to see Len, the next door neighbour, who's also the deputy sheriff, and David's mother invites Daisy, his wife, over for a cup of tea. And David knows that they're beginning their investigations. This is how they do it. And he says that his mum hits pay dirt with Daisy. And it says here, this is the quote again on page 51. On one of my passes through the kitchen, Daisy was hunched over the table, her white hair bobbing in my mother's direction, and her tanned, plump arm reaching toward my mother. Daisy's usually loud, brassy voice was lowered, but I heard her say, "The word is he doesn't do everything on the up and up." Then she noticed me. She straightened up and smiled at me, but stopped talking. This meant I was supposed to leave the room, and I did, but slowly. As I crossed into the living room, Daisy whispered, "Just the squaws, though." So there's the word of this around town. Then she sort of talks to his father, and his father's like, I just talked to Len about the weather. I don't want news of this getting around town. His mother says, look, news is around town more than you realise. And he says, look, I need evidence. Before I say anything, before I do anything, there must be evidence. David's mother's much more willing to go on gut feeling, but he is not. Wesley Hayden is not. He requires evidence, and he's now going to set about finding it. And that brings to the close the first. Oh, there's a very key bit here at the end. I'll just read to you from page 54 again. My mother continued to stare at him. I'll handle this, Gail, in my fashion. After a long silence, my mother finally left her post at Marie's door. She was almost out of the kitchen when she turned and said to my father in the calmest voice she had used all evening, "Just one thing, Wes. You never said you didn't believe it. Why is that? Why?" She waited for his answer. I waited too, breathlessly, looking down at our floor, speckled linoleum, and holding my sight on one green speck until my father said, "Of course I don't believe it. Of course it isn't true." But he didn't say a word. He simply picked up his fork and continued to eat Daisy McCauley's rhubarb cake. That was when it came to me. Uncle Frank was my father's brother, and my father knew him as well as any man or woman, and my father knew he was guilty. And that's how we end the first section of this text.